everyone, thanks for joining. On today's NCL Summer Live, we're going to be diving through the basics of HTTP and HTTP security, and you'll learn how browsers communicate with websites, common vulnerabilities that you can use on insecure websites, and we'll also run through a demo challenge so you can see an exploit live. We're going to be doing one of these videos every single week covering a new topic based on viewer demand, so please stick to the end where we provide a poll for the next week's topic. We're doing this series to help you all learn, so please ask any questions in the chat. And without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So, the web. What is the web? The web, also known as the World Wide Web, is just a system that allows for the sharing of resources through the internet. And you can access the web through a computer browser. So you're probably familiar with Chrome, with Firefox, Safari, or Edge. And when you use the computer browser to visit a website, what's happening is that your computer is making a request to another computer and you're trying to access some sort of resource. That could be a news article, it could be a tweet, an image, anything that you see in your browser. And in this system, the computers need a standardized way to communicate with each other. And that's what HTTP is. It's the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the common language that your computer can use to speak to another computer on the internet. And there are a lot of different protocols that computers use to communicate, but visits to websites in your browsers, every one of those uses HTTP, and that's why it's important. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol, you've either seen this as like the HTTP or the HTTPS in the browser when you go to visit a website. It's the HTTP protocol itself is a plain text protocol, which basically means that all of your traffic is unencrypted. That means that if you visit a normal HTTP website without the S, anything that you send across the internet is going to be viewable. And this is probably why you see all these ads on like YouTube and stuff for like VPNs, because that's how they can help you secure that traffic. But by itself, HTTP traffic is not encrypted. And anything that you type in there can be seen, if you're connected to like Starbucks Wi-Fi, it can be seen by everyone on your wireless network. Or it can be seen by Starbucks itself or any ISP, Verizon, AT&T. And that's why you want to use HTTPS instead of HTTP, because HTTPS is secured. The HTTP protocol has a basic request and response model. Basically, it means that when your computer is connecting to the internet, connecting to a website, it's making a request to that website to access the resources on that website. That request is made in a standard format so that when it's received by the server, by the website that is processing your request, it can understand it. It can dissect it and make sense of what your request is. Then it will send a response back, and that response is also standardized so that when your browser gets that response, it knows how to interpret this image, this video file, whatever it is, and display it on your browser. The HTTP protocol is highly extensible, which basically means that you can make add-ons and a lot of modifications on top of the protocol using the protocol as a solid foundation. So this is where you get things like caching and geotagging and stuff like that that can happen directly within the protocol itself. When you are making requests on the internet using HTTP, there are different methods, and you can see them all here at the bottom. Now, there's a bunch of them, and we're only just going to cover the first two because these are the two most common protocols. These are GET requests and POST requests. So GET requests, you can just imagine this as you are making a request to retrieve a resource and not make any sort of change. So you are specifically trying to fetch a web page, an image, a video file, audio file. That request does not change anything with the server. It does not change anything with the website. For POST requests, these are requests specifically designed to modify something on the website, such as submitting a form or maybe uploading an image. So when you actually submit your form, you are making a modification. Maybe you're submitting a form for your profile on a website. You're actually making modification to your user profile. If you're uploading an image, you are actually inserting your data, that image, onto the website, onto that server. And so those are two very different requests, and they're the two most common requests that you're going to see with HTTP. When you actually visit a website in your browser, you are using a URL. And this is an example URL that we have here. And what you might not notice is that the URL is actually split into different components, and each one has a pretty important purpose. And so at the beginning, we have the HTTPS here. That's the protocol that lets both the browser and the server know that this request is going to be encrypted. If that is misaligned, if that's the reason why you want to have the protocol there. If it's misaligned, then there's a lot of confusion. If your browser is sending encrypted traffic to the website and the website is running on HTTP and not HTTPS, then it's going to get gibberish and it's not going to know what to do with it. So the protocol has to be aligned. Next is the host. This is specifically referencing the website that you are trying to connect to, right? This is how you distinguish between Reddit and CNN or Twitter or any other website that you're visiting. This is happening in the host section. Following the host section is the path. This is the specific resource that you are trying to access. So in this example, it's the contact page. This could also be a specific image. It could be a tweet, that specific tweet. It could be specifically, hey, I want to view my Twitter feed. All of that happens in the path. And the very end here is the query. These are specific options that get sent to that page. So for example, if you do a Google search, after you type in your search and you get sent to the search results, on that search results page, if you actually look at the URL in your browser, it will have in this query section your search that you typed in. And so what's happening is you are hitting the search path or whatever Google's calling it. And on that page, it's reading your query and using that query to give you specific search results based on that query. And so together, the protocol allows the website and the browser to make sure that to know that they're communicating using the same protocol so they can understand each other. The host indicates which website you're trying to connect to. The path is indicating what resource you're trying to access. And then the query is indicating any options that you want to provide to that page. This is the actual request, the HTTP request that will get sent out when you type in your URL and you hit enter in your search in your browser. And so this is actually taking this previous URL here and it's showing what it looks like as a HTTP request. And you can see here that we have the method, the get at the beginning, and then you have the resource, the path that is being requested. That's a /contact path. Then you have the protocol and a version number there. And then below that, you have what we call headers. These are single lines that just provide other options and values to the website that you are trying to connect to. And so what we're actually seeing here is the host, which is pretty important. That's so that if you have a computer that is handling requests from multiple different websites, this host header lets that computer know which website you are making that request for. And then you see this accept text /HTML that's indicating what type of response your browser is looking for. And this becomes pretty helpful to make sure that the server is sending the right data back to the browser, because the browser is going to try to display that data. And so if the server is sending a different file format than the browser is expecting, there's going to be an issue there. This request is being sent. Your browser is a program that's running on your computer. Your browser is acting on behalf of your computer. It's sending that request across the internet to a server. The server then is reading this data. And it's literally this text, right? This text is being sent across the internet and then it's being received by the server. The server parses it out and it says, okay, you are trying to get the contact page for cyberskyline.com and you're using the HTTP protocol version 1.1. It will then figure out what to do with that. Maybe it's specifically has a HTML file, and then it will actually send that HTML file back to the browser. And that happens in the response. And you can see here, this is an example server response. And at the top, you have the protocol version. You have a status code. 200 means okay. There are a bunch of different other status codes. You can look those up online. But the 201 means that it's okay. And then you have a bunch of other headers here. You have what server made the request, what server processed that request, the software of that server. You have the timestamp, the date of when that was made, the content type of the response, how long that response is, when this resource was last modified. E-tag is used for caching purposes. Expires is indicating when the cache expires. And then you have cache control here, which is indicating the maximum age. How long should that be cached? And so just breaking down what I kind of said here, these are all different headers. We mentioned at the beginning that HTTP, that protocol, is extensible. These are all different options that are built atop that core protocol that can be used to modify that request. And so by default, caching doesn't exist in HTTP. It's all of these different headers that are building upon the HTTP protocol that allows caching. And so for caching to occur, basically what needs to happen is that the server needs to tell the client, the browser, when was this last modified, so that if the request happened after it was, before it was last modified, it needs to send a new version now. If a cached version was cached before that last modified date, it needs a new copy. And there's also that expiration, so that if the browser is caching that information, that the browser knows, okay, after this date, I need to go back to the server to get a new one. And if you're not sure what caching is, I'll just go into that briefly. Basically, caching is a system that tells the browser, save this resource on locally so that you don't have to keep coming back to the server every single time. And so let's just say, as an example, we have the Cyber Skyline logo on our website. The browser can cache that logo so that every single time you make a request to the website, it's not constantly sending this image back and forth. The browser will save the latest version of the logo, and if it changes, the server will let it know, and then you'll get a new version of it. And that all of that is being built on top of the core HTTP protocol using these different headers. And so all of this stuff is kind of optional, but it allows that extensibility for the caching. And then below the caching, we have the body, which is the actual substance of that request, of that response. And so the request is, I want to get your website. And then the response is, here is the website code. And the HTML code here is, HTML is just a language that tells the browser how to display web data. And it also has information about the fact that, hey, this code should be cached, and it should be cached for this duration, and this is the last time it was modified. And so if the browser makes this request again, the server will actually say, hey, you can actually use the old version of it and not actually send the response back, and that'll let your computer load those pages much faster. And so this is actually the life cycle of an HTTP request. You type in the URL into your browser converts that URL into this request. That request gets sent to the server processes that request, and then it sends a response back with any additional information that it wants to send. And then your browser reads that data, it reads this HTML, and it figures out, what do I display on the page? Now, what will commonly happen is that when you type in a URL into your browser, the first page, when you hit enter, your browser is going to make one request to get that page. This HTML response is the contents of that page, but it's just the code for that page. And it's not necessarily even all of the code. It's just like the minimum code that is necessary for that page to run. What could then happen is inside this HTML could be other assets that have not been loaded. So for example, an image. Before your browser actually figures out what is on the page, it can't load the image. It doesn't know which image is going to be on the page. And so this initial request for when you hit enter is going to get the layout of that page, and it's going to see, oh, there's an image here, and then it will send subsequent requests to go and get those images, or maybe there is some audio files that it needs to retrieve. Other times there's additional code that needs to be grabbed to do different things, like maybe there's some code that is needed for handling your login requests, and that code is not initially sent so that your computer can load it faster, right? If it can get this initial request just to get the layout of the page, it can then make subsequent requests for more information from the server while the page is loading, and that'll speed up your experience. And so just keep in mind that like your browser is actually sending many more requests in the background than what you might even realize, right? Because when you do that initial browse to a page, that's just one request that you are directly causing. But then when the browser reads the HTML and it's processing that information, it might then request additional images or additional assets of some sort that you might not even realize is happening behind the scenes. It's all kind of hidden from you. But it seems pretty simple, right? I mean, if you look back here, you make a request, you get some data back. How do you actually break this? And so there are some common ways to break this. Let's just look through the life cycle of I'm wanting to go to cyberskyline.com and I'm wanting to log in. What actually happens? The first thing that happens is that you make a post request. So if you remember, the post request is used to make some sort of modification. And so when you're logging in, that's kind of like data that you're sending to the server, and you want to modify your status to now be logged in. And that's one request that gets sent out. The server is then parsing your request, and then it's checking its database. It's saying, okay, you want to log in as Franz. I need to see, is there a Franz user in my database? And then I need to make sure that your password matches. And then after your password matches, I need to say, okay, cool, you're logged in. I need to record that you've logged in. And then I'm going to send data back for your login information. What typically happens here is that when you log in, the website is going to send you some sort of information that you will then send back to indicate that you are logged in. These are the common web vulnerabilities called the OWASP Top 10. Common web vulnerabilities that you might find. So the first one is injection, second one, weak authentication and session management, and third one is cross-site scripting. And so we're just going to go over these first three, but if you want to learn more about the other things, let us know, and we'll make another episode about that. With injection, the premise behind this is that user input cannot be trusted. Sometimes people genuinely make mistakes, and sometimes they're intentionally trying to mess with you. And so in the best case, you get some bad data in your database. And in the worst case, they can manipulate server behavior. And so what does that mean? Basically, if I submit this login request, that login request is going to the server, and then the server has some code to process that login request. And it might look something like this. It might take in your username and your password, and it might look up a query on the database for that username and password. Pretty straightforward. And this is your unsuspecting database that's getting this query, right? It's pretty straightforward. I'm just gonna search for the username and password and see if a user exists with that username password combination. The problem is that that specific query in reality might look like this. It might look like, and this is called SQL. This is the language used by a lot of databases to communicate between the code and the database. It might look like select ID from users where username equals, and then it'll put in the username that you typed in, and password, and then it'll put the password that you typed in. So if you think about what's happening here, this is a very common vulnerability where the database query is literally having the user input inserted into it. So what happens if when you typed in your username and password, you added additional, not just like an actual username or an actual password, but what if you put in SQL, right? What if you put in like the actual language here to change the conditions that it's searching for? What if you changed it so that you said where username, is admin and password is 123, or 1 equals 1, or you can have another truthy value. You can say or true equals true, or a equals a, like any sort of like truthy value when this is being interpreted and it's checking, okay, I need to find this username and the password needs to match, or if the password doesn't match, maybe true equals true. And so in that circumstance, the password that you type in, the password of the user doesn't actually matter, because if you overwrite these conditions and you specifically tell the query to look for the valid password or any other truthy value, that is always going to resolve as true. And so it doesn't matter what the password is. It's always going to say, okay, yeah, there's a user with this username and 1 equals 1 or true equals true. And so the password is kind of irrelevant in that circumstance. If that is a little bit confusing, let us know and I'll try to clarify it. And maybe we can have another episode about conditional operations and how that works. But if you take like a CS 100 class, they'll cover this, where when you write conditions for the computer, it's checking, are these two things true? And if the requirement is that both things need to be true, it uses an and. And if the requirement is that only one of the two things needs to be true, you can use an or. And that's where this is dangerous. If the user can say or 1 equals 1, then it doesn't matter what the password is, because if only one of those two things needs to be true and one is always going to be true, then the result of the password check and 1 equals 1 is always going to be true. The basic solution to preventing this is just to make sure that the username and passwords only contain allowed characters. This can be tricky because it reduces the possible passwords, the possible valid passwords, and it can be annoying to people if you're like, yeah, you can't have that you can't have that character in your password, you can't have the quotation mark in your password, or you can have the equal sign in your password. That could be pretty annoying. The more advanced solution is to use something called a SQL parse tree to evaluate that the syntax hasn't been modified. That's a little bit more complicated, but basically, like the SQL parse tree is a system that says, hey, this is my template. I'm expecting my SQL query to have two conditions, the username check and the password check. And so if there are magically 3 conditions now, then something went wrong and I should ignore it. That's an oversimplification of how SQL parse trees work. So definitely if you're interested to learn more about that online, but that's kind of a more advanced solution. So it doesn't even matter what the actual characters are. The parse tree would prevent an injection like that, because it would just throw out and reject any request that didn't follow the same pattern as the initial template. Another vulnerability that can happen is weak authentication and session management. And so let's look at this example here with this URL. We have a cyberskyline.com, and then in the query parameter, we say user equals admin. If you're specifying the username in the URL that you have permissions to access, that's terrible, right? I mean, if someone sees that and they log in and it says user equals, ABC123, they could just try, well, what happens if I do user equals admin? And if that's the way that you're doing session management, then anyone can get access to any account. All they would need to do is change the URL and put a different username here. So that's really bad. There's another thing that you could do as well, which is you can store that information. Instead of storing it in the URL, you store it in something called a cookie. I'm sure if you've been to any website, you've seen kind of the big cookie warning, the little pop-up that's like, we need to use cookies. Do you allow us to use cookies? Cookies are basically just a way for websites to store a small bit of information on your browser. And this is really important for session management because by default, the information about like what user session you're logged in with or what username you have and all that stuff, it's not being remembered by your computer. And the website is not able to keep track of all of those different things in your requests because it's not in your request unless you put it in with a cookie. And so what the cookie does is when you log in, the website can say, cool, you're logged in, save this information, and then any single time you come back to me, give me that information so I can remember who you are. And in this example, we have a cookie that's setting the user value to admin. And so while it's not in the URL, it's not as easy for someone to see and exploit because it's not in their browser. If they edit the cookie, then they could change the user that they are, and that's not good either. Both of these really rely on the user input, and so you can't trust it. And you're probably wondering then, okay, if you're not saving the username that you're logged in as, what do you save? And this is what you could do. You could save the password there as well, so you can verify that, like, okay, if someone changed it, if someone changed the username, you don't just let them in because they need to have their password there. The problem with this is that if you're constantly asking people for their username and password, it's really annoying. People don't like doing that. It's also it's also a problem if it's being stored in the URL because that information might be logged. If it's in the URL and you're visiting a website, if they're saving logs of every single page that's requested on their website, then everyone's username and passwords are stored in those logs. And if a hacker got access to those logs, they have everyone's username and passwords. So it's really not a good idea to store that information for every single request. You want to basically confirm that, hey, your password and username match, you're logged in, and don't give me your password until the next time you need to log in. The best way to handle this is to use a cryptographically secure token to validate the user. That's basically fancy speak for saying that, like, when you connect to my website and you log in, I'm going to then create a unique ID, and then you can use that unique ID to log in. And so if that unique ID gets stolen, it's not that bad because it doesn't have your username and it doesn't have your password. And those tokens are also designed to expire after a certain period of time. Maybe it's 24 hours. If you have like a bank account that like expires like after like 20 minutes of you being inactive, that's an example of these short-term secure tokens. And now the risk has been limited so that if someone were to see the request that you're making, instead of being able to steal your username and password, they can now only steal the token, right? If they're looking at the URL and the headers and all that, they can only steal the token. And if they just steal the token, then they only have access for the limited duration that token is valid for. Maybe it's the 20 minutes that your bank might have, or maybe it's one day, 3 days. Some websites don't expire them, and that's a little bit of a security issue, but it really reduces the risk here. And it's also why you want to use HTTPS traffic. So when you make that request, all of that data is encrypted. And if you combine the two, where the request is encrypted and the URLs are not, if the URLs are being logged somewhere, or your browser is saving them locally on your computer and your computer gets compromised, that information can't be stolen as easily if you're using a crypto mechanism to authenticate the users. The last thing I'm going to cover here is cross-site scripting. And cross-site scripting basically allows a malicious person to run their own code on a website. And so a very common thing which you might see is in the query parameter, there's information that gets directly put onto the page. And so for as an example here, this isn't an actual website vulnerability that we have, but if you have this 2018 fall in the query parameter and the code for the website is going to take this query parameter and just like display it on the page, what happens if instead of this being text, like normal text, it's code? And so here is something that could happen is if a hacker put in this JavaScript code, and it's, in this example, all it's doing is making a pop-up, but it could be a lot more malicious than that. It could be code to steal your passwords, to be a keylogger, to track every single thing that you type on that website. You really don't want your website to be vulnerable to this. It causes huge problems. If someone clicks on a URL with this cross-site scripting, they can become victim to this attack. And so to prevent this, there's a couple general rules of thumb. Number one, just don't run any code that is coming from anything that the user provided, especially without sanitization. And so if you know that this query parameter is being displayed on the page and that the user could change the query parameter, then you got to be very careful not to run anything that is being put in that query parameter. Another thing is to understand how your code is being executed or rendered on the page, making sure that you realize, okay, is the logic that I have here only going to display what the user inputted, or is there a chance that it could run that code? And also be very, very wary of any script tags. So if you have any code, that's in script tags or any script tags that the user could provide that will run, that's very dangerous. So for example, if you had a script tag which ran something that the user inputted, so if you have the query parameter there, the season information that we had, and that is being run inside a script, you got to be careful. Or if you're allowing the user to put script tags in their input and then running that, obviously that's pretty dangerous. So definitely map out your flow diagrams of figuring out like, okay, this data, where did it come from? Is there a chance that the user could input it? There are some like pretty indirect ways that you might not realize, because what if the user inputted data is coming from your website? What if what happens is the user is making a tweet? Let's just use Twitter as an example. They're making a tweet and they put code in their tweet. And so when someone clicks on that link, it's actually not it's not in the URL. The code is not in the URL, but it's being sent back by the server because that code is actually sitting in the database with information that the user supplied. And so this is really, really dangerous because you might not realize that this is user supplied information because it's coming out of the database. So make sure that you use flow diagrams and map out, where's the data coming from? Can we trust it or not? So how do you find vulnerabilities? Big way is just by looking at the HTTP response and then looking for some key things. One is the server version and any other software that is being run on top of that server. So in this case, the server is Nginx and there's a version number here, and it's being powered by this Express framework. Definitely when you're looking at these things, if you see something that you don't recognize, Google it and find out if it has a vulnerability. And that's exactly what we recommend. Check for Express 4.0 vulnerabilities, checks for Nginx version 1.15.4 vulnerabilities. You can do all that using Google. You can also use these vulnerability databases. So big one is CVE, that's being run by MITRE. You can check to see if there's any vulnerabilities for those software versions. And you can see, what other frameworks there are. And now you've kind of learned the basics of web security, right? You're going to want to analyze the website, find anything that might be vulnerable with the software version. There's some much more in-depth things that you can do, but it's going to come down to basically looking at the requests themselves, seeing is there vulnerable software version on here. I'll add that you definitely want to check to see if there's any user input that you can modify. Maybe you can cause a cross-site scripting vulnerability by modifying some input. But that's just the gist, is that you're looking at these different requests that are going through your browser and seeing if there's anything vulnerable with that. And I'm actually going to go into a demo now so you can see how does that actually work, right? Like what does it mean to actually look at the browser, look at the HTTP request? How do you actually go about doing that? So I'm pulling up a demo here, and we've got a vulnerable web application, and it's a login form. And so just by looking at a login form, there's immediately, if you remember the examples that we used in the slides, there's immediately like some attention being put into what can I do with the login form itself, right? You can look at different, if you got like a website with multiple different pages, you should definitely look at the different pages, see what's there. Maybe you run an automated tool like Dirbuster that will tell you what pages are on that website. But starting out as for a very simple challenge here, we're presented with a login panel. That's definitely the first place to look. And our task here is basically conduct a security audit and figure out what the flag is. So we're going to want to break in. I'm going to open this in a new tab, and I'm going to open up the developer tools. And that's how we're actually going to be able to see these HTTP requests. And so you can do that in most browsers by typing in F12 on Windows, or you can also do right click on the page and then do inspect or inspect element, and that will bring up the developer tools. And you're going to want to go to the network tab of developer tools. And we're using Chrome right now, but you can do this in most other browsers. Definitely would prefer using Chrome or Firefox. I think Safari might hide some of this information. Internet Explorer and Edge, I think you have to like turn on different settings to get all of the information that you would want. But this will show us all of the HTTP requests that are being made. And if I refresh the page, you can actually see all of those requests here. So from visiting one page, there were actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 requests that were made. There were some requests so you got the request for the actual page itself. And then there are these JavaScript files that were requested. This is some extra code that's being run. There is this close.png. This is an image. And if we actually click on this and we zoom in here, you can actually see it's kind of faint because it's white on a white background. But that's the X. This X up here. There's this woof2 file. This is for fonts. And then we have the icon that goes up here, which doesn't look like there's anything. But those are all the different requests that are being made. What I want to do right now is I want to actually try to log in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to preserve the log here. I'm going to log in. I'm just going to type in gibberish and see what happens. Okay, we got invalid login credentials. But we can look at the traffic that was produced, and there's this request here, and you can see user is QWE and password is password. So I wonder if this autocomplete typed in the word password. Let me ABC123. All right, there we go. There's ABC123. I think the default might have been password and I didn't type in the password. And we have some questions here. I'll address those questions in a second. Let me just go in and show how this works. So we made this request here. There's a username and there's a password, and let's see what the responses are. So we can see here's the server that's being run. And below that is this set cookie. So if you recall, the cookies are the way that your browser is saving information that is being provided by the server. And in this case, the server is telling the browser to save admin equals false. And this is just expiration information about the cookie. It should only save it for 900, whatever that is, seconds or milliseconds. And this is going to expire pretty shortly. So I'm assuming this is This is this is supposed to be secure. It's supposed to be something where you're only logged in for a very short period of time. But that brings up a pretty interesting question, right? It says admin equals false. What if I make it admin equals true? Is it just going to automatically let me get to the admin panel? And that's definitely something worth investigating. So let's actually go and figure out how to modify the cookie. It's going to be the modifying the cookie is going to be different depending on your browser. And we're doing this with Chrome right now. There's probably similar or like pretty equivalent named tabs in the developer tools. And you could do this in any modern browser. We actually had someone ask in the chat, what about Brave? Brave will work as well. It's not as popular, so I don't know how their developer tools are, but definitely, if you have any other browser, it should have these capabilities. What I want to do is I want to go to the memory tab because that's oh sorry I want to go to the application tab because that's where we're going to find the cookies. And definitely, if you're starting this for the first time, I would recommend just poking around and like seeing what's in every single one of these tabs, figure out what information is there. And I can see in the application tab, there are these different types of storage. So on top of cookies, there's also local storage, which is a different type of information that can be stored in your browser. There's also this like web SQL, IndexedDB. Different applications might use different things. There's cache storage. There's all this information here. But we're interested in cookies. So let's go to cookies. And we can see there are 3 cookies here. There's this 1P jar. Not really sure what that is. It's coming from gstatic.com. So in this domain section, there might be different assets from different websites being loaded onto to a single page. And so in this case, these are some external websites, gstatic and Cloudflare. This happens very, very frequently. If you visit any single website that has like a Facebook login or whatever, it's loading the Facebook login information from Facebook itself. And so Facebook is going to be storing some information. You're going to have a request being made to Facebook if you actually visit any single website that has like a Facebook login or whatever. Even if you don't want to use Facebook, it's kind of like forced upon you that way. But that's what we're seeing here is these external websites are storing information in our browser because this website is using those external sites for some purpose. But if we go to the cookie here for the admin, you can see value equals false. I'm actually just going to come in here. I'm just going to type in value equals true. And we'll just give this, you're probably wondering like what now? Like we made the cookie true. What should we do? Definitely reloading the page is the first way to go. So if we reload it, we don't get anything. Let's try to put in some junk login information. Maybe it redirects us to the admin panel after we log in. And there we go. Oh, it didn't like my password because I just typed in QWE. So for those of you who have QWE as a password, you definitely shouldn't have that. It's an insecure password. But we're now in the admin panel. Look at that. And it's got a bunch of default data here. But what we have right now is the new flag that we can copy and we can paste it right here. And we've completed our first challenge. And so kind of diving into what do we learn here, when you're given an admin panel or a login page, you want to mess with that as kind of like a good first step. And you're going to want to open the developer tools, or maybe you have something like Burp Suite or some other tool which will save and record all of those requests that you're making, and just see what information is being sent back and forth between the server and the browser. What's happening is that it's effectively a conversation, right? Your browser is having a conversation with the server, and the server is responding back and forth. What you're doing is you're just looking at what they're saying to each other, and you're figuring out, is there anything I can do that is outside of what a normal human would do when using the website to break the model? A lot of times there's this thing called security by obscurity. People will build websites or build services that are insecure, but they can't be bothered to go through the effort of making it secure, and so they have this security by obscurity where they're hoping no one will ever find it and hoping that no one will take advantage of it. And this might be a case of that. I don't know if the people who built this really thought that doing admin equals true or admin equals false in the cookie would be the most secure way of doing things. They were probably just assuming, no one's ever going to change this, so it will serve our purposes. So that's definitely something that that you don't want to do. If you're building a website, don't rely on security by obscurity. And if you're on the other side, if you're trying to find vulnerabilities, you definitely want to check for different things that the developer might not want you to be looking at. They probably don't want you to be looking at the requests themselves. The login logic is something that they probably don't want you prying into too much from a security perspective, but that's how I would do it. And we could definitely do more of these. I think some of the other topics are going to be a little bit more complicated to explain. So those different vulnerabilities, they're going to require episodes of their own. But if you want to learn about them, please let us know in the chat. We have our topics to choose from for next week already chosen, but I'd be curious if anyone has any specific website vulnerabilities that they would like us to dive into. We could definitely add those for future episodes. So I'm seeing there's actually a question here from Tally. Tally's asking, what is the content length measured in? Content length is measured in bytes. And so that's how big in bytes the request is or the response is. We got another question here. I've been following for the past couple of weeks. Any suggestions on where I can practice or review the info covered? So great question. In the short term, I would definitely recommend looking at if you're looking for specifically like web security, I would definitely recommend looking at the OWASP top 10. If you're looking at more than just that, we are going to be making the practice gym available in the next couple weeks, and we'll definitely cover that in an upcoming session. So stay tuned. We're gonna actually give you the ability to dive into this stuff and get the hands-on practice. So yeah, great question. Stay tuned and we will provide that practice directly. I have another question in the chat. Does NCL provide any remote internships to help students get real world experience? So NCL, we're a community, we're a competition. We don't have the internships ourselves, but definitely you can use your NCL experience as a good way to get an internship to help get that additional real world experience. A lot of times the challenges that you're doing in NCL will give you that real world experience, like doing this website audit. In past episodes, we covered analyzing log files or looking at packet captures. Those are all real world experiences. They're just not under an internship. But as you're building your resume, as you're trying to work towards your career, you can definitely use NCL as a springboard. I know getting your first internship, getting your first job can be pretty challenging. And I think that if you do NCL, it's going to give you that real world experience. It's going to give you something to talk about when you do the interview. And it's a great way to get that internship if you want that on your resume. Someone asked as well, did the flag show up in the application cookie? I thought I saw it before you entered the admin page. That's entirely possible. Let's actually take a quick look here. If we look at our application, yes, there it is. It's right there, flag, and it's stored as a cookie, which means that if we specifically look at the request that was made, we should be able to see the server telling the browser to store that cookie. If I can find the right one. It's got to be before the login. Okay, cookie admin true. Oh, it's in the request. I need the response. There it is. So when we visited the admin panel, there is the set cookie here, and it sets it up there. All right. Well, I appreciate you all joining us today. Definitely, if you have any lingering questions, ask them in chat right now. And I'll put up a poll for everyone to vote on what topic they want us to cover next week. So give me 1 second and I will put that up. But thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you all next week. Please vote in the poll. I just put it up. What topic you're interested in covering, and until next time, have a great day. Take care.